の美しい顔を見たら、お前は腰を抜かすじゃろ。
Welcome to episode 55 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are discussing international folk horror, with two films that explore the horrors of war, capitalism and greed, while referencing the histories of the countries in which they were made. First up, we have Onibaba from Japan, which was released in 1964. This was directed by Kaneto Shindō and stars Nobuko Otowa, Jitsuko Yoshimura, and Kei Satō. Then we follow this with our first film from India, Tumbbad from 2018, and director Rahi Anil Barve. This stars Sohum Shah, Jyoti Malshe, and Mohammad. Along the way, we'll be discussing the career of Kaneto Shindō, Japanese no theatre, the history of India's independence, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used in researching this week's episode, and as usual, all sources will be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing Onibaba, I have referred to interviews and extras on the Blu-ray release of the film from Eureka Entertainment, and the book Introduction to Japanese Horror Film by Colette Balmain. I've also referred to interviews and articles on the websites criterion.com, igajejutsu.blogspot.com, theguardian.com, japantimes.co.jp, and signalhorizon.com. And when discussing Tumbbad, I have referred to interviews and articles on the websites indianexpress.com, scroll.in, filmcompanion.im, dailydead.com, austinchronicle.com, medium.com, and sohumshahfilms.com. And as always, I have also referred to the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the movie's cast and crew. Along with his 1968 film Kuroneko, Onibaba is one of only two horror films directed by Kaneto Shindō, a Japanese director, film producer, and writer whose directorial career spanned 59 years and 48 feature films. He was born in Hiroshima Prefecture in 1912, and his films understandably often concern the horrors unleashed by the bombing of that city at the end of World War II. These include Children of Hiroshima, released in 1952, Mother, released in 1963, 1988 Sakura Taichiru, and Teacher and Three Children, which was released in 2008. Even those not directly about the bombing, like this week's film Onibaba, can be seen as allegorical, exposing the hardships experienced during wartime and the collapse of civilized behavior that escalates as a result. Born into a relatively wealthy family, he first experienced hardship as a child when his father went into bankruptcy after acting as a loan guarantor. The hardships of his childhood were no doubt influential on the themes of his later films. He would later say that his main historical interest was to focus on ordinary people and their energy to carry themselves beyond the predicaments they encountered daily, going on to say that his mind was, quote, always on commoners, not the lords, politicians, or anyone of name and fame. I wanted to convey the lives of down-to-earth people who have to live like weeds, end quote. So, a recurrent theme of many of his films is the hardship experienced by his female characters, and it's likely that this was, in part at least, influenced by his mother, who became an agricultural labourer following his family's financial decline. She died when Kaneto was still a young child, and he later moved in with his older brother, who had travelled to the city of Onomichi to work as a policeman. Once there, he saw a film called Bangako no Isho by the director Sadao Yamanaka, a story of an unconventional samurai which also focused on the struggles and personal injustices experienced by the quote-unquote lower classes. This film had a significant impact, leading to an interest in filmmaking and setting the path for the rest of his career. After saving money by working in a bicycle shop, and with only a letter of introduction from his brother to a policeman in Kyoto, he set off for that city in the hopes of finding his way into the film industry. Once there, through the brother of the policeman to whom he had been introduced, he was able to get a job at the film studio Shinko Kinema and was one of 11 workers in the developing department. It was here that he learned that films were made based on screenplays, something that, according to his autobiography, A Life in Screenwriting, he learned because old screenplays were being used as toilet paper. Each night when he finished work, he would take home scripts to study them, and began to learn the relationship between the screenplays he was reading and the films that he was helping to develop. A year later, in 1935, Shinko Kinema moved from Kyoto to Tokyo, and Shindō went with them, initially working in the art department, and then slowly making his way upward to the scenario department, where he began working as an assistant to the director Kenji Mizoguchi. By this time, he had begun writing his own screenplays, but he was frequently told he had no talent at all. Nevertheless, he continued at his craft, and this paid off, with the first adaptation of one of his screenplays arriving in 1940 with the film Nanshin Sei, or Southern Advancing Women. But then, in April 1944, despite being graded Class C in the military physical exam, he was drafted into the Navy. Initially, he was one of 100 men who were assigned to clean buildings, but shortly after this, colleagues were chosen by lottery to serve on a ship, and they all died when the ship was attacked by a submarine. Another 30 were selected by lottery to serve on a submarine and were never heard from again, and an additional 4 were selected to be machine gunners on freight ships that were converted for military use and also subsequently died in the war. The loss of so many of his colleagues was something that haunted him for the rest of his life, and he would go on to say, quote, "I have always had the souls of the 94 with me, and I have made them the theme of my existence." End quote. After the surrender of Japan in 1945, he began working at Shoshiku Studios, where he began writing screenplays for a director called Kanzaburo Yoshimura, beginning a relationship that has since been described as one of the most successful film partnerships in Japan's post-war film industry. The two first achieved critical success with a film called A Ball at the Angelo House, which was released in 1947, and a year later it would win the Kinema Junpo Award for the Best Film of the Year. But both he and Yoshimura were very unhappy at the studio, and in 1950 they left to set up an independent film production company called Modern Film Association, which would go on to produce most of Shindō's films, including Onibaba. In 1951, Shindō made his directorial debut with his film Story of a Beloved Wife, a fictionalized account of his first marriage, which had come to a tragic end in 1943 when his wife died from tuberculosis. It also recounted his early experiences of having screenplays turned down, and introduced him to the actress Nobuko Otowa, with whom he would begin a relationship despite having remarried in 1946 through an arranged marriage. Otowa, who stars as the older female character in Onibaba, would become his muse as well as his mistress, appearing in the majority of his films that he made during her lifetime. She starred in his next film, Avalanche, released in 1952, after which he was invited by the Japan Teachers Union to make a film about the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima, a very controversial subject as it had been forbidden under post-war American censorship. Nevertheless, Shindō agreed to the suggestion, making Children of Hiroshima, which was released in 1952. This followed a school teacher, played by Otowa, who returns to Hiroshima 7 years after the dropping of the first atom bomb to discover how her friends and ex-pupils have lived since that day. Much like his first film, Story of a Beloved Wife, it was highly praised, but was also criticized for being overly sentimental, particularly by the Japanese Teachers Union, who felt that it lacked clear political and social criticism as it concentrated on the stories of just a few individuals. After this, he continued to make political films that were social critiques of poverty and of the suffering endured by women in Japan. These include 1953's Epitome, the story of a young girl forced to become a geisha to support her family, and Dobu, released in 1954, about the struggles of unskilled workers and petty thieves. He also made a film called Lucky Dragon No. 5, released in 1959. This told the true story of a fishing crew irradiated by the atomic bomb tests conducted by the States following World War II. Although it wasn't commercially successful, it did win a Peace Prize at a film festival held in what was then Czechoslovakia. But by now, his studio was close to bankruptcy, and had his luck not changed, it is doubtful his career would have continued. Fortunately, though, his luck did indeed change in 1960, when he released a film called The Naked Island, a nearly wordless film that once again starred Otowa in the story of a small family struggling to get by on an island over the course of a year. The film, into which Shindō had invested all that was left of his money, won the grand prize at the 1961 Moscow International Film Festival, and in 1963 it would be nominated for Best Film from Any Source at the 16th British Academy Film Awards. Its success led to Shindō not only making his first trip out of Japan to attend the Moscow Film Festival, but also to its being sold to 61 countries, something that saved his production company and allowed him to continue filmmaking. So, as we can see, his filmmaking was highly political, though he would later say that, although he was a socialist, he was an artist first and not a politician. Quote, "I do not see the class struggle as it appears in the political arena. I like to see it and describe it as it affects the individual human being in his daily life. I like to look into the political and class struggle with the eyes of an objective artist. It's so easy to view social conflict with political idealism, or at least with the tainted eyes of political desire. I strive to avoid this by all means. After all, struggles are endemic to our society, with its many faults and contradictions." End quote. Nevertheless, he would follow The Naked Island with two more politicized features. The first of these was Ningen, released in 1962, which tells the story of the crew of a ship sinking into desperation as they lose the ability to navigate following a storm. After this, in 1963, came the film Mother. In this, Otowa stars as a woman whose son is diagnosed with a brain tumor as a result of the bombing of Hiroshima, and who agrees to marry a man on condition that he pays for her son's medical treatment. At this point, though, his focus shifted slightly. Though there was still a political subtext, he began to focus even more on the role of the individual in society, and in particular sexuality and its relationship with survival, saying, quote, "Political things, such as class consciousness or class struggle or other aspects of social existence, really come down to the problem of man alone. I have discovered the powerful, very fundamental force in man which sustains his survival and which can be called sexual energy. My idea of sex is nothing but the expression of the vitality of man and his urge for survival." End quote. And with this new direction in mind, he began working on the first of this week's films, and the film for which, to many, he is still best known in the West. All of which, of course, does bring us on to the first of this week's movies, which is Onibaba, written and directed by Kaneto Shindō. Released in 1964, it stars Nobuko Otowa, Jitsuko Yoshimura, and Kai Satō. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so, as always, if you've not seen the movie, it's time to press pause and return once you have. The inspiration for Onibaba came from a bedtime Buddhist story that he had heard from his mother when he was a child. This had been written by Saint Renyo, who later became known as the Great Restorer of Shin Buddhism, and his teaching method was to reach out to the masses using instructional stories. One of these was a fable called The Mask of Flesh, sometimes also known as the Legend of the Devil Mask. Its purpose was to act as a cautionary tale about the karmic dangers of jealousy and deceit, and according to the director himself, it went something like this. Quote, "Every night, a wife goes to pray in a temple, and her mother-in-law doesn't like her doing it. To stop the wife from ever going to the temple again, the mother-in-law puts on a demon mask and hides behind the bushes along the path to the temple, scaring the wife to death. However, Buddha punishes her wrongdoing, and the mask becomes fixed to her face, unable to be removed in any way. It only comes off when the mother-in-law prays to Buddha and Buddha's great mercy acts upon her. Although the mask does come off, her skin is ripped away with it, and the mask becomes a mask with flesh. This fable was used to teach uneducated peasants how great Buddha's mercy is. It was a clever idea to build this tale upon the relationship between the wife and the mother-in-law, since wives were the central figure of the family, and by saving their souls through the teachings, it was easier to attract more followers." End quote. And this story is very much the final third of Onibaba. However, Shindō did make a few key changes. In his story, which expands on his philosophies about human sexuality, the wife isn't going to pray each evening, but is instead going to see a man. He also set his story in 14th century Japan, when the country was divided between two imperial courts in the north and the south, and was forever in a state of war. According to Shindō, during this time, quote, "It seemed as though people starved and lost their ways. However, people hid themselves in the grass and survived. Men and women kept their sexual relationships, which is an important reason that we are still here today. This fact lies at the heart of my film." End quote. And Onibaba is indeed a very sexual movie, and though it seems tame by today's standards, it is probably the most sexual film we've covered to date in this series. This certainly also goes partway to accounting for its popularity when it was released in the States, where the promotion lent heavily into this aspect, tagging it the most daring film import ever. But while the film is sexual and very fleshy, there is also far more to it than just this. It builds on many of the themes that Shindō presented in his earlier films, emphasizing the impact of war on the so-called common people, women in particular, and the desperate lengths that those impacted will go to in order to survive. Shindō has said that setting this film in the past allowed him to dissect modern issues, as he found that without the distractions of modern civilization, the themes presented in older stories are often more clear-cut. Quote, "I'm not saying that all historical eras are similar to today, but by using a comprehensible social structure, such as we had in the past, it is much easier for me to convey or recreate modern situations." End quote. And so, in Onibaba, there are implicit references to the bombing of Hiroshima, with the disfigured faces created by the mask deliberately representing the impact of radiation poisoning. These were based on actual photographs of people known as hibakusha, a Japanese word that translates literally to bomb-affected people. In addition, the war that ravages the countryside is presented as completely pointless, a vanity project created by the quarrelling of the two emperors, and across which men switch sides with apparent regularity. "It's all the same to us," says the character of Hachi, who has deserted the war and returned home to the marshes, going on to say, quote, "It is the general's war, not ours. We don't even know what they were fighting about. At first we wanted to be heroes, but killing isn't easy." End quote. Onibaba opens in an expanse of Suzuki, or Japanese pampas grass, known for its towering 2-meter stalks and associated in Japanese culture with good health and prosperity. For Shindō, though, it represents a symbol of the world and the society which surrounds the characters and within which they try desperately to survive. And it's also a world into which the eyes of the lords and the politicians do not reach. Immediately, our perspective switches, and we are within a pit in the ground, looking up from its depths into the clear sky, while a single symbol fills the screen. This is the Japanese symbol for the word whole, and it is followed by the words, quote, "Deep and dark, its darkness has lasted since ancient times." End quote. Suddenly, the sound of the Suzuki grass blowing in the wind is pierced by a shrill, discordant note from the soundtrack, as the title of the film appears on the screen, Onibaba, which translates to demon hag or demon woman. Shindō has said that the symbolism in his films is very Freudian, and so the whole can, of course, be read as representing female sexuality, much as the dead tree, which appears later in the film, is an incredibly blatant phallic symbol. It can also be said to represent the character's constant state of hunger, an insatiable pit that can never be filled or sated, ever present and always waiting. More than this, though, for Shindō, the whole is a metaphor, representing those at the bottom of the social heap and the violent means to which they must turn in order to survive. A darkness that, as the titles tell us, has lasted since ancient times. The shooting location was in the Imbanuma marshes in the Chiba prefecture and had been a very difficult setting to find, with others before it rejected as they had been occupied by the military or had been divided off into smaller plots of land. After it had been discovered by one of the 8 directing assistants working on the film, Shindō says that he took one look at the grass blowing in the wind and immediately thought it was perfect. But perhaps, had he fully appreciated the challenges the location would present, he might not have rushed to judgment quite so quickly. Located a train ride away from Tokyo and a 10-minute drive from the station, there was no accommodation for the cast and crew to stay while filming, and so they erected prefabricated buildings at the location in which to live for the 3 months of shooting. Shindō has referred to this as being held captive, something that he thought essential to ensure full commitment to the project. But although he remained at the location for the entire 3 months, other members of the crew and the cast were given a brief respite every 3 weeks, when they were allowed to return to Tokyo for 2 days and 1 night before returning to the set. Shindō has recalled that, on occasions, he was worried some might not come back at all, and though everyone did come back on time, one can understand why he felt that some of them might not, because life at the location was incredibly harsh. Firstly, the area was infected by mites and insects, including poisonous moths, and this created a risk of disease. Fortunately, no one actually became ill, and this seems a bit of a minor miracle, as there were no medical facilities at all on site due to the restricted budget. Every evening, the insects would swarm around them, sometimes flying into the actors' mouths when they were trying to speak their dialogue, and every night traps would be set up to kill as many of the swarms as possible. As well as the insects, shooting through June, July and August meant that the heat was often unbearable, something that was intensified by the smell of the Suzuki grass itself, which Shindō said smelled terrible the hotter it became. The grass itself was also incredibly sharp and painful, and at points in the film you can see grass cuts on the skin of the lead actors. This is particularly true of Jitsuko Yoshimura, who plays the young wife, and Kai Satō, who plays the neighbor Hachi, as they were required to run through it again and again, often nude or semi-naked, and Yoshimura would later recall that she was covered in scratches and grass cuts by the time that filming wrapped. And in addition to the swarms of insects and the Suzuki grass, the river, which is in reality a man-made canal, was also like a quagmire, and numerous stones and rocks hidden in the earth also made filming an incredibly uncomfortable process for both the actors and the crew, who were also frequently covered in cuts and bruises at the end of each day. After the opening credits, we move back to the fields of Suzuki grass, through which 2 samurai, one carrying his badly wounded companion, are trying to escape from 2 other samurai in the distance who are riding through the fields. Filmed from a god's eye view, we track their progress as the grass shifts around them, sometimes visible and sometimes not, until finally, nearly exhausted, they collapse onto the ground. And then there is a sudden rustling from the grasses around them, and they are both suddenly killed, quite brutally, each pierced by a lengthy spear. At first, we suspect that this might be the axe of the samurai seen earlier, but then the grasses part and we see that it is instead two women, a mother and daughter-in-law played by Shindō's muse and partner Nobuko Otowa and Jitsuko Yoshimura, who was only 19 years old at the time of filming. Unlike the male characters, even the absent ones, the two women remain nameless throughout the film. This turns them into symbolic representations of the oppressed as opposed to actual people, a state of existence with which Shindō clearly self-identified, saying in several interviews later in his life, "I am Onibaba." Left to fend for themselves while the son of the family Kichi was enlisted for the war, the two women have been forced to survive by any means necessary. In this case, it is the murder of samurai fleeing from battle through the grass fields, who they then strip of their armor. Once they have stripped them of their possessions, the bodies are disposed of in the hole. The taking of life here has no significance, other than as a means to an end. The armor itself is then sold to Ushi, a dubious black marketeer, in exchange for provisions, and Ushi then sells the armor back to the military, creating an endless cycle of death and profit which emphasizes Shindō's views on war, commerce, and capitalism. After the first murders, and ignoring Ushi's leering suggestion that they should sell their bodies to him instead, the two women return to their hut and they gorge themselves on their profits, a scene of ravenous hunger being satisfied that will be repeated throughout the film. This happens first here with millet, and then later with fish and roasted birds, and even later, sorry animal lovers, a dog which is aggressively beaten to death when they catch it in the fields. These scenes are designed to reflect the constant state of hunger that the characters contend with, but are also strongly sexual, with an emphasis not just on consumption, but also its aftermath, as the two collapse onto their bedding in a fashion which suggests post-orgasmic satisfaction. These interior nighttime scenes were the only time that actual lighting was used, with the rest of the film shot in natural daylight. The use of light and shadow in these moments is extraordinarily beautiful, but given the low height of the roofing and the fact that the huts were made of dried grasses, it was achieved through no small amount of risk. And even though the lighting used was incredibly low-level lighting, there was still at least one occasion where one of the huts caught fire. Into this environment comes Hachi, a neighbor returning from the wars, having deserted along with Kichi, the son of our main family. Unfortunately, Kichi has been beaten to death by farmers after he and Hachi tried to steal some food, though it is hinted that this was mainly Hachi's suggestion, as he explains that it was he who thought he might die from hunger, with no mention of Kichi's motivations whatsoever. As well as these stories of Kichi's untimely death, Hachi also brings with him apocalyptic stories of the war, telling of a horse giving birth to a calf, the sun rising black in the sky, and the day turning as dark as night, as if the world had been turned upside down. We also learn that all of the farmers are starving, that the fields run wild without men to till them, and that in Kyoto people are eating worms and snakes, and that everything has become food. Meanwhile, in the grass fields, frost and hail plagued the previous summer, and all of the crops failed as a result. While not explicitly synonymous with Hiroshima, it is hard to see these stories as anything other than allegorical, particularly the day turning to night and these stories of acute food shortages and starvation. We do know that all of this happened in Hiroshima following the bombing, although initial Western reporting, controlled by the US, initially concealed the devastating human costs. Even the story of the horse giving birth to a calf can be seen as allegorical about the fear of birth defects, and if nothing else, it at least suggests that nature and the social order have been completely subverted. Played by Kai Satō, Hachi is an immediate disruptive element. Lecherous and leering, he is instantly curious as to how the two women have been surviving, repeatedly asking how they live and eat until he is told it is none of his business. He himself has survived the journey home by killing a priest and stealing his clothes, making it easier to get around, he says, because, quote-unquote, people trust priests, another sign that the social order has collapsed. More importantly for the narrative, though, he also presents a threat to the women's relationship, both physically and psychologically. After all, the two women are related only by marriage, and with the news that Kichi is in fact dead, there is very little to keep them together other than the need to survive. The next morning, the daughter-in-law is beating her washing by the river and is interrupted by Hachi, who once again asks her what she does for food. It is clear that by this point he has become suspicious as to how the two have been surviving, firstly by the amount of food in their hut and then by the nature of their clothing, which, incidentally, both actresses slept in during filming to add to the realism of their costumes. And while his dialogue simply accuses them of stealing, saying reassuringly that people in Kyoto do it too, the glint in his eye suggests that his suspicions are actually much closer to the truth. We also see the first signs of sexual tension as he stares lasciviously at her while she beats her washing, asking if she has been saving herself for Kichi's return and what she will do now that he is dead. "No use staying with that old woman, is there?" he tells her. "You're still young. How about coming over to see me?" And although at this stage the daughter-in-law is still very much subservient, seeking permission from the mother to take the fish that Hachi offers, it is clear that there is also something on her side as well, as she lies when asked what the two were discussing and watches him depart with more than a little curiosity in her eyes. This scene, though, is interrupted by the sound of horses on the far bank of the river, and we see two samurai battling on horseback, a fight that ends with both of them in the water as Hachi and the two women watch from the other bank. One swims towards them for help and is stabbed by Hachi, who orders the two women to get the other one before he floats away, showing that he has indeed worked out the secret to their survival. "We can eat now," he tells them. "This is expensive stuff." And so he visits Ushi and trades their spoils for millet and a bottle of sake, complimenting the trader on his business, to which Ushi responds that it will only be good as long as the war lasts. "They'll carry on even if it ruins the country," says Hachi. "War is a business with them." From here, he begins to pursue the daughter-in-law more aggressively, watching her through the grasses and waving flirtatiously when she goes to collect water in the morning. And though the daughter-in-law is initially wary of the interloper, who is described by the mother as being a dog in heat, it is clear that she is also tempted as she returns to the river in an effort to see him again. It comes as no surprise then when she takes up his invitation to see him that evening, waiting until the mother is asleep before sneaking out of their hut. And here we have the first of many, some might say too many, scenes of the girl running through the grasses at night time, accompanied by the amplified sound of the grasses and the cooing of pigeons, the latter of which was added in post-production as pigeons are said to be incredibly fertile. One of the major criticisms thrown at the movie is that there are just far too many of these sequences, and it has to be said that they do become more than a little repetitive. And while they are doubtless included to show the girl's growing freedom as she breaks away from the mother, there are, in fact, only so many times you can watch someone run through Suzuki grass before you start thinking, yeah, I've got the point now. After spying on the two having sex, first in the grasses and then after following the girl to Hachi's hut, it becomes quite apparent that the mother is suffering from sexual jealousy. She runs into the night in another beautifully lit scene, grabbing her own breasts in sexual frustration, and then wraps herself around an incredibly phallic dead tree. Like I say, Shindō's films are unbelievably Freudian. And her frustrations are spelled out even more clearly the next morning, when she finds Hachi lying in the grass fields and standing over him as he lies prostrate in the grass, offers herself to him instead, reminding him that she isn't old on the inside. This is one of the many beautifully composed shots in the film, the positioning of the two actors hinting that he can see all that she has to offer, making it all the more humiliating when he rejects her advances with barely a blink of an eye, preferring instead to go for a swim. But there is more to it than just sexual frustration. As she points out to him, without her daughter-in-law to help her, she won't be able to kill on her own and will have no means by which to survive. She is then reduced to begging him to leave the girl alone, at least until the war comes to an end, to which he replies, quote, "There's no telling when it will end," end quote. Her motivations then are incredibly complex, combining sexual frustration, fear of abandonment, a need to maintain the status quo, and a desperate sense of self-preservation. She may be portrayed as the villain of the piece, but it is hard not to feel sorry for her situation, driven to desperate measures by the circumstances in which she happens to have found herself. Shindō expanded on this in later interviews, saying, quote, "Behind the surface drama, there is a story other than the one we are now discussing. It is that everyone in my films, the mother and daughter-in-law in this case, is invariably an outcast of society. They are people totally abandoned, outside society's protection. Among these outcasts, I wanted to capture their immense energy for survival. Obviously, the mother has done very cruel things, like preventing her daughter-in-law from finding another man. She is punished for these acts, but this punishment is an expression of the uncontrollable events which these people meet in their actual lives." End quote. The first cruel act that the mother commits is to try to imply that Kichi isn't dead and that Hachi has been lying. When this doesn't work, she tries to play upon the daughter-in-law's grief and then attempts to bargain with her about finding her a better quality of husband. When this fails, she attempts to keep the girl within eyesight at all times of the day, accompanying her to the river and ensuring that, during daytime at least, there is no opportunity for any further rendezvous. Nighttime, however, presents a very different problem, and so she decides to play on a fear that has been used across history to keep people in line, the idea of sin and the misappropriation of religion. "It's a terrible thing," she says. "Once in Kyoto, I heard a great priest talk. Those who sin in this world go to purgatory when they die. They say that hell really exists. A hell of fire, a hell of fury, a hell for sinners. The terrible mountain of needles, the lake of blood. The punishment for sinful lust is the worst of all. Souls with human faces grow 4 legs and fall into a sinner's hell. There they are tortured day and night with red-hot irons." And then, as luck would have it, an opportunity presents itself to make this misappropriation seem all the more real. One night, when about to follow the girl once again to Hachi's hut, the mother is first frightened and then threatened by a samurai in a demon mask, who is trying to find his way through the grass fields and onto the main road to Kyoto. Threatening her life unless she helps him, the two set out into the night. Not, as the samurai thinks, in the direction of the main road. As the two travel through the fields, they engage in a conversation as to why the samurai wears the demon mask. He tells her that it was to protect his beauty in battle, though he also tells her, somewhat obliquely, that were he to remove his mask, his beauty would make her faint dead away. But as it turns out, and as we might have guessed, she is not, in fact, guiding him towards Kyoto, but instead towards the hole in the ground, and jumping across it, she allows the samurai to plummet to his death. She later returns with a rope, down which she climbs to the bottom of the hole, and for the first time we see the full extent of the women's crimes. The hole is littered with skeletons, among which lies the samurai, who grabs at her ankle as she tries to remove his mask. Is this a final death twitch? Is it a warning? Is it a curse? It's all rather difficult to say, and possibly it's all three. In any case, when she finally removes his mask, having to tear it from his face, she sees how disfigured his face has become beneath its surface, something that should surely warn her that wearing the mask herself might not be the best idea. But, of course, a demon mask would be the perfect tool to illustrate her story of hell and frighten her daughter-in-law into submission, and so she takes it anyway. The mask that she appropriates is from the world of Japanese no theatre, a popular form of entertainment originating from the 14th century. No theatre is characterized into 5 different narrative styles, each distinguished by the type of character around which the story revolves. There are plays about gods, plays about warriors, plays about demons, plays about women, and plays about madwomen. It is also distinguished by the extensive use of masks that were designed to change expression depending on how they caught the light, allowing the performer to convey a surprising range of emotions despite wearing what would appear to be an immobile piece of carved wood. This specific mask, characterized by its metallic horns, glaring eyes, and twisted mouth, is called a honya and is used to depict a woman consumed by jealousy and transformed into a vengeful spirit, an external representation of the wearer's internal self. But it is also a mask of tragedy, conveying both fury and anguish, capturing the pain behind a spirit's malevolent actions, and this is something that we see later in the film when the mask cannot be removed. From this point on, the mother ignores the rather obvious red flags and begins to wear the mask to scare her daughter-in-law as she journeys through the fields at night. And so, after what is a rather slow build-up, we reach Shindō's version of the Buddhist fable. The mother uses the mask on 3 occasions to scare her daughter-in-law into submission, giving rise to the film's most famous images as she appears masked and wraith-like in the Suzuki grass. On the first and second occasion, her ruse is a success, and the girl runs home, leaving Hachi waiting, unfulfilled and frustrated. The third time, however, is far from being the charm. There is a terrible storm, and the girl runs, not back home, but into Hachi, who has come to meet her in the rain. But worse is yet to come. Returning home, the mother discovers, as in the legend, that the mask is firmly stuck, and unable to remove it, she must wait for her daughter-in-law to return in the hope that she can help her. Meanwhile, Hachi returns to his hut and finds a deserting soldier within, eating his food. A flicker of recognition seems to cross his face. Is this in fact Kichi, not dead at all and returned from the wars, living proof that mother was right and that he has been lying all along? Or is it just another deserter, showing the cyclical nature of life during wartime? We never discover. Hachi is stabbed in the chest with a spear in the same fashion that he earlier killed the samurai in the river and is left to die alone. Meanwhile, the daughter-in-law returns to the hut, where she finds the mother crouching in the corner, her face still hidden beneath the mask. Begging for forgiveness, she implores her daughter-in-law to pull the mask from her face. The tables have now turned. The daughter says that she will try, providing the mother agrees to her terms of continuing to see Hachi, not knowing, of course, that he is now lying dead. After several wince-inducing attempts, the mask is finally split in 2 with a hammer, but as we know from the fable and from the scarred face of the earlier samurai, what is revealed beneath is not the face it was before. It is now corrupted, ravaged, and bleeding. No longer recognizing her at all, the daughter-in-law once again mistakes her for a demon and runs out into the night. The mother chases after her, with her final words before the credits roll, "I am not a demon, I'm a human being." For Shindō, this ending signifies not a moment of horror, but instead a moment of salvation, shown by both women jumping over the hole at the very end of the film. Because although the mother's face is disfigured, her wounds will eventually heal. Quote, "Through punishment, I wanted her to escape the confines of her own old world. In fact, for both women to escape. I punish her, but this punishment is not a kind which ends her world. It does not involve the overt force of punishment alone. I meant this punishment to be a spiritual one, so that through suffering I could reveal the real soul of the mother herself. After her recovery, we, the mother and the director, are ready for the next step into a new world, a stage which might take us into a new future." End quote. Onibaba was released in Japan in November 1964 and in the US a few months later in February 1965. In Japan, the film was lightly censored to remove a brief glimpse of pubic hair, but in the UK it was refused a certificate by the BBFC and wouldn't be released until 4 years later in 1968, and even then that was a very heavily censored and truncated version. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, in the US the marketing lent heavily into the sexual content, and Onibaba drew cues at the Toho Cinema in New York for the first time since the venue's opening. Reviews in the West, however, were somewhat mixed. Variety praised the performances, but commented that it was, quote, "sometimes high adventure and exciting, and at other times dull in its so-called symbolism. Too often, this turns out to be a potpourri of ravenous eating and blatant sex." End quote. Meanwhile, our friends at the New York Times described it as, quote, "neither new nor especially inventive in achieving its stark and occasionally shocking effects." End quote. Since its release, it has been reassessed and re-evaluated, and some suggest that it is a forerunner of what we would later term J-horror. I'm not so sure about that aspect, but it has certainly been influential in other areas. William Friedkin, the director of The Exorcist, called it one of the most terrifying films he had ever seen. Guillermo del Toro, who named a character, Onibaba, in his film Pacific Rim, said that it, quote, "did some serious damage to his psyche," end quote, and Robert Eggers has said he was thinking about Onibaba when he made his film The Witch. Actor Willem Dafoe is also another fan, selecting it when he paid a visit to the Criterion Closet and saying, quote, "I wanted to remake it, and I even got the rights for a while. But I couldn't find a way to do it because it's so specific to its time. I felt like any time I tried to put a spin on it, I ruined the source material, so I couldn't do that." End quote. But a remake did emerge rather recently, or kind of, at least. This is the rather unfortunately named The Dreadful, which, according to the director Natasha Kamani, is not a remake, but is based on the same Buddhist parable that inspired Shindō. Okay, if you say so. Set during the Wars of the Roses in England and starring Sophie Turner, Marcia Gay Harden and Kit Harington, it didn't do particularly well with either critics or at the box office, and as I've not seen it, I can't really comment any further than that. After Onibaba, Kaneto Shindō directed 25 more features, including one more horror film. This is Kuroneko, which was released in 1968 and which, true to his recurrent themes, concerns the vengeful spirits of a mother and a daughter who are raped and murdered by samurai. In total, he directed 48 movies and wrote screenplays for 238. His final film, titled Postcard, was released in 2010, by which time he was 98 years old. He died of natural causes, aged 100, on the 29th of May 2012, and according to his son Hiro, he was talking in his sleep about new film projects, right to the very end. All of which brings us to our second film of the week, one which was 25 years in the making from its original inception and filmed over several years and 4 monsoons. This is our first Indian film of the series, Tumbbad from 2018. It stars Sohum Shah, Jyoti Malshe and Mohammad and was directed by Rahi Anil Barve. Then again, perhaps it wasn't. There was also a co-director, Adesh Prasad, and a creative director, Anand Gandhi, and as recently as last year, there was an announcement that Barve didn't actually direct it at all, though more on that a little bit later. And we are getting into the spoilers right away with this one, so, as usual, all warnings apply from here on in. Tumbbad is a story that is, partly at least, about greed and the way in which it corrupts on both an individual and a generational level. It opens with a quote attributed to Mahatma Gandhi, who was an Indian lawyer and political ethicist, and who successfully led India's independence movement, and in doing so, inspired civil rights movements across the world. Quote, "The world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed." End quote. But although that quote is attributed to Gandhi, it is in fact a paraphrase of a longer statement from an address he gave in Madras on the 16th of February 1916, in which he said, quote, "Nature produces enough for our wants from day to day, and if only everybody took enough for himself and nothing more, there would be no pauperism in this world, and there would be no man dying of starvation." End quote. So, food for thought next time we hear about the activities of the globe's toxic billionaire population. But more than just a parable about greed, Tumbbad is also a story of India's history, split across 3 distinct time periods that track the development of the nation from 1918 to the 1940s as the country transitioned into independence. According to the film's creator, Rahi Anil Barve, quote, "The film starts when the Peshwai era is on its last legs. They ruled us for about 100 years and vanished. That's the first chapter about the generation of Vinayak's mother, when India was still feudal. She, as the mother as well as the country, is exploited, but they are happy to get just 1 gold coin. The second chapter begins with an adult Vinayak who wants more. The world of that time is dealing with World War II and the repercussions of imperialism. The final chapter is about the third generation, Vinayak's children, who are not satisfied with luxuries alone. They want to rob the bank. At the same time, India has become independent, and we see the country embracing capitalism. For me, the period between the 1920s and the 1940s is the most important in our history, as it set the tone for the India we see today." End quote. The origins of the film date back to 1993, when Barve was 14 years old and in the forests of Nagzira, a national forest and wildlife sanctuary in the state of Maharashtra. While here, a friend told him a story by a writer called Narayan Darab, an Indian author who worked primarily in horror and who was the first Marathi author to bring H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos to the region. This story, Aji, which translates to grandmother, is widely identified as an adaptation of a story called Grandma by Stephen King, and it sowed the seed for what would later become Tumbbad. The title of the film, though, which is a real region in the country, is taken from a novel called Tombachi Kol, though the relationship to this work ends there. Reading more of Darab's stories, including one called Bali, which means sacrifice, Barve began writing his first draft of the film aged 18 in 1997, and then began teaching himself the art of filmmaking. Born in 1979, Barve is dyslexic and did not continue with school after Class X, which equates to the 10th grade, or the age of about 14. "Ever since I can remember," he says, quote, "I wanted to make films, but I didn't know how I would go about it. I didn't pursue college, but started taking jobs at the age of 15. I learned animation for these jobs. When they brought a semblance of financial stability, I started working on my film dream." End quote. And so he began his journey into film through the world of animation, and eventually moved on to work on international projects, including Spider-Man and later Iron Man. At around the same time, he met a cinematographer called Pankaj Kumar, who helped him film his first short movie. This is a film called Manja, which was released in 2006, and which so impressed director Danny Boyle that it ended up as a special feature on the Blu-ray release of his film Slumdog Millionaire. While editing this, the two began discussing Barve's idea for Tumbbad, conversations that would eventually develop into the incredibly striking look of the film, And I might as well get it out of the way here and now, as I know it's a phrase that I overuse each episode, but Tumbbad is indeed strikingly beautiful. And this beauty was initiated in these discussions, and then began to take shape in a 700-page storyboard that Barve began to create for the project, which was completed after 8 months of work in about 2007. But there was no real Indian precedent for this film, which made financing incredibly difficult. The first producer attached to the project was a man called Anurag Kashyap, and although he ultimately stepped away from the project, he continued to provide mentorship and advice to Barve on how he could pitch his ideas. Even then, though, the project passed through multiple hands and many false starts before it finally found a home. According to Barve, quote, Tumbbad was greenlit by 7 studios, who loved the film and then backed out. I had no frame of reference for them. Nothing like Tumbbad had ever been tried before. I don't blame them. After all, it involved crores of rupees. No one believed in me or the film save Anurag Kashyap, who tried for 4 years. But I was then rescued by Sohum Shah, who came on board as the producer. End quote. Sohum Shah, who would not only produce the film but also take on the lead role of Vinayak, is an Indian entrepreneur and actor who began his career in the real estate business before relocating to Mumbai to make films. Starting his own production company, Recyclewala Films, his first movie was the critically acclaimed Ship of Theseus, released in 2012, which was named by some reviewers as one of the most significant films to have ever come out of India. Barve approached him with his 700-page storyboard, and the actor-producer was immediately impressed, later saying, quote, When I first saw the script, it had this seed of craziness. The ideas were so good that it made me pursue them for the film. The film looks like a fairy tale narrated by your grandmother, but a little darker than those, like we have made our own mythology. End quote. Shah was one of many creatives who came aboard the project, including Anand Gandhi, the director of Ship of Theseus, who would act as co-producer and creative director, though more on this a little later. There were also writers Mitesh Shah and Adesh Prasad, who helped shape the original story into its final screenplay, with Prasad also working as co-producer and co-director. As you can see then, it was very much a collective enterprise. But according to Prasad, quote, It was solely because of Sohum Shah, the lead actor and producer, that the film got made. It was purely because of his madness and his ambition that drove the film. You don't normally spend so much money on a film unless you have a star, and even then they ask you to bring down the darkness, bring in something lighter, add family values, make it more universal, which I understand from a commercial point of view. But the film was purely because we had Sohum as a producer. But even with the lead actor, producers, writers, and a co-director on board, the production process was a very arduous one, as it had already been established that much of the film could only be shot during monsoon season. The film would, in fact, take 3 years to shoot, with filming taking place across the months of July and August. And this lengthy filming process presented a personal as well as a production challenge for the lead actor. He had to gain weight for the project and was also filming 2 other movies at the same time. He later said of this, quote, I had to hit the gym and take care of my body because I was supposed to gain weight for the character. We shot in the rain multiple times, and by the end of it all, I was exhausted. Then I was simultaneously shooting Talvar and Simran, and I had 2 separate looks for those movies. But these were not major obstacles. The toughest part was not to forget who Vinayak Rao was and what he was made of throughout the period, and also to get a grasp of the Marathi diction, which was new and challenging, so there were many things to think about. End quote. The film begins then with the quote from Mahatma Gandhi, and then, through narration, we learn the mythological heart of the story, spoken by the character of Vinayak Rao to his son, both of whom we meet later in the film. Quote, "The goddess of prosperity is the symbol of unlimited gold and food, and this earth is her womb. When the universe was created, she gave birth to 160 million gods, but the goddess loved her first child above all, Hastā. But today you won't find his name in any ancient scriptures, because he wanted all of the goddess's gold and food. He managed to get the gold, but just as he went for the food, all the other gods attacked him. With every blow, Hastā shattered into fragments. But before he could dissolve into stardust, the goddess saved him, but on one condition, that he would never be worshipped and be forgotten forever. For aeons, Hastā slept in his mother's womb. But one day, our ancestors invoked him and built a shrine in his name. They say, since that day, all the gods' wrath has been raining on Tumbbad." End quote. "Well, why did we ever wake him up?" asks the child. "Because Hastā's curse is a boon for us," replies Vignec. "You'll know when you go inside, into the goddess's womb." This is narrated over a CGI representation of the story, and at first glance you might be forgiven for thinking that what we are about to watch will also seem, being completely honest, a little poorly created. However, what follows is in fact a dazzling story spread over multiple decades, enriched by the excellent cinematography of Pankaj Kumar and visual effects that were unprecedented in India at the time. Kumar's cinematography, captured in widescreen, is very much in evidence from the opening shot of the movie proper. This is the exterior of a decaying mansion, as the character of Mother, played by Jyoti Malshe, makes her way inside through the pouring rain. And although the film was shot in monsoon season, they still needed to use multiple water towers and artificial rain, designed to create a feeling of wetness at all times. Kumar would later say that they wanted the audience to feel drenched when they came out of the theatres. We learn that the setting is the village of Tumbbad in western India and that the year is 1918. This was a politically significant year for the country, and it also marked the end of the First World War. During this time, in which Indian soldiers had played a major role within the British Army, with 1.56 million Indians fighting alongside the British, the country was very much in the grip of the British Raj. However, within the system, power was both feudal and patriarchal, shown by the character of Saka, an elderly Zamadir, or feudal lord, who sits waiting on a porch swing, his bright eyes lit with a combination of lust and expectation. Mother is his mistress, a role that she has, we later discover, held for 12 years. During this time, she has borne Saka 2 children, Vignec and his younger brother Sadashiv, who we will meet in the following scene. Tasked with the rather odious duty of giving Saka a handjob, she tells him to hurry up as it will soon be dark, and that she is terrified of not feeding the quote-unquote old hag on time. In the corner, we see a shrine to the forbidden god Hastā, decorated with a single gold coin, a coin that has been promised to Mother, providing, of course, that she earns it, though surely she's been doing exactly that for the past 12 years. Meanwhile, her sons run across a steep hill towards a stone building in the distance, another superbly shot moment by Kumar, with the camera first tracking them before it sweeps upwards to the heavens, exposing the forbidding sky of the monsoon season. The film had to be moody and gloomy, said Kumar. There was to be no daylight. Tumbbad village had to look timeless, without a clear demarcation between day and night. He went on to say, quote, "The challenge was to find large landscapes without modern infringements, without towers and structures. We didn't have the luxury of using visual effects to erase modern elements. Besides, we didn't want to rely on VFX. Everything had to look live. There are 4 color schemes, blue and cold grey, slashed with striking red and gold. You see the colour schemes in the costumes and the set design, and you see it in the light source too. We used lantern and lamplight in all of our scenes. We avoided modern lighting since Tumbbad is a period film. Our lighting setup comprised about 50 lanterns and lamps, and some things were lit with just a single lamp." End quote. This lighting is very much apparent as the two boys enter the stone structure, where we learn that something rather horrible is housed just down the hall. This is the old hag mentioned by Mother in the earliest sequence, an ancient being who we later learn is the boy's great-great-great-grandmother. She is monstrous in both appearance and behaviour, and she also needs to be fed by others, not just because of her increasingly advanced age, but because she is chained to the wall in her room. This first chapter of the film is based very much on the writings of Narayan Dhurab, and by extension the story Grammar by Stephen King. In this, a young boy is left alone with his ailing grandmother, who, spoiler alert, turns out to be a witch who obtains her power from an ancient deity called Hastur. And this is a name originally created by the writer Ambrose Bierce, and which was later incorporated into H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. The use of the name in the movie Tumbbad, although it is admittedly spelled and pronounced differently, has led some viewers to interpret the film as Lovecraftian, though I would argue this is a tenuous connection at best, and that the story is rooted more in India. As Sohum Shah said in a 2024 interview, quote, "The idea of Tumbbad was born from our fascination with folklore and mythology, particularly the darker, lesser-known tales of greed and curses. We wanted to explore something that felt both personal and universal, blending a very Indian story with a global cinematic appeal. We were one of the first to blend mythological horror with deeply rooted Indian folklore in such a visually captivating way." End quote. That being said, though, as with most films, there are certainly other influences at play. In an interview given at a festival screening, co-director Adesh Prasad admitted that, while the idea was born from the folklore of his country and its mythologies, the creative process also drew from other regions. Quote, "The inspirations come from everywhere. It's very difficult to say exactly where because some of it is mythology, but some of it also comes from shows like Tales from the Crypt or Game of Thrones. I think it's reflected in our film in a very fun way because I find the film very schizophrenic. It starts off as something, it becomes something else, and then it becomes something else, and it just keeps changing until the climax of the film. And I think the reason for that is because there have been so many influences poured into it." End quote. Much as in the original stories, whether Darab's or Stephen King's, young Vinayak is left alone with his great-great-great-grandmother when his younger brother Sadashiv is fatally injured, and his mother flees in a carriage to try to get him to hospital. Far too late, as we soon find out. Meanwhile, Vinayak is left to feed the grandmother, though he forgets the magic phrase that will stop her in her tracks. "Sleep, or else Hastur will come for you." He mispronounces the name of the taboo god as Hiran, Magar, and Harak, among others. He also accidentally covers himself in flour, a recurrent and important motif in the story, and this gave cinematographer Kumar a visual element to play with, saying, quote, "We used the moment of the child's spooked-out face covered in flour to our heart's content." End quote. This is an absolutely brilliant sequence, with grandmother a truly monstrous being right out of a nightmarish fairy tale. "Who is this little prince?" she whispers, before luring Vinayak into her chamber by promising him the secret of the treasure that is reportedly hidden inside Sarkar's mansion. This is the first sign of Vinayak's inherited generational greed, a concept further elaborated on when he and his mother, having buried her youngest child on a funeral pyre, travel down the river to the city of Pune. "You little rascal," she tells him, thrusting a single gold coin into his hands. "This is all you care for, right? Keep it and shut your gob. You're just like that serpent, your father. I'll kill you if you ever return to Tumbbad." But of course, Vignec does indeed return, and this is 15 years later, in 1933, a time when India was enmeshed in anti-colonial struggle. 3 years earlier, in 1930, Gandhi led what has become known as the Salt March from Ahmedabad to the coastal village of Dandi, covering a distance of 241 miles in 24 days. This is one of the most famous acts of non-violent civil disobedience in history, and was a protest against the salt laws introduced by the truly disgusting British East India Company and imposed by the British Raj. These laws forbade Indians from manufacturing or selling their own salt, guaranteeing the British a monopoly on the market and forcing the population to buy salt that was heavily taxed and often imported. Beginning with 78 of his followers and with growing numbers joining them along the way, when they reached their destination, Gandhi broke the salt laws by making salt through evaporation. And this was an act that sparked large-scale acts of civil disobedience against the British. It also led to more than 60,000 Indian arrests, including Gandhi himself, who was held without trial for 8 months. And there are certainly significant references to this during this second chapter of the movie, with talk of civil disobedience marches, freedom fighters, and much more. At one point, Vignec complains that his wife has been brainwashed by Gandhi's talk of female empowerment, while his friend Raghav, a moneylender and would-be opium dealer, responds, quote, "The British government is great. Sure, they interfere with our religion, but what can you do?" End quote. Though, being blunt, he says this with more than a little bias. Raghav is in secret talks with a corrupt British army officer for a piece of the opium trade, another monopoly established by the British East India Company and later enforced by the British Raj. As a colonial power, Britain forced poor farmers to grow opium poppies and then bought their products at cripplingly low prices, fining the farmers if their yields were too low or failed to meet their strict quality standards. From this point, the British would process the harvest to produce a more effective and highly addictive version, which was initially traded at a profit to China until international agreements and Chinese prohibition policies brought this trade to an end. Yes, not only was the British Empire founded on exploitation, but it was also strengthened by the drug trade. We really were a horrible nation, weren't we? By 1930, the time period for this chapter of the movie, the monopoly had shifted focus domestically and for medicinal use, and while not as profitable as it once had been, it was still a very lucrative market. But as always, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let's backtrack to Vignec's return to Tumbbad and his family reunion with his great-great-great-grandmother. Having been cursed by Hastā to live as an eternal monster, the details of which are revealed later in the film, she is still very much alive, but as Vignec discovers, she is not the surprisingly active figure that once tried to eat him. Instead, she now lies paralyzed on the floor of her room, her heart beating within the branches of an enormous tree which has sprung out of her body. And as Vignec has grown from a small boy into a man, his generational and inherited greed has also grown. In fact, he says that it is his only quality. And so he makes a deal with the grandmother that he will free her from her eternal torment in exchange for learning where exactly inside Sarkar's old mansion the treasure might be hidden. And even though she is quite clearly a monster, there is also a little humanity left within her, as she warns him of the potential consequences of his actions. "Save yourself from this curse," she says. "The last time it turned me into a monster. Don't start the cycle of destruction again," going on to warn him, quote, "Entering those gates is your choice, and after that nothing else will be. Not everything you inherit should be claimed." End quote. Vinyek, of course, though, doesn't listen, and after a period of what must be months, judging by his hair and beard growth, he eventually finds the entrance to the hidden well in the mansion, discovering off camera what lies within it before he returns to his grandmother and carries out his end of their bargain. He now returns to the city of Poon and reunites with his wife, who, in his absence and presumed death, has started a business grinding flour, which, as I mentioned, is a recurring motif in the film. Nor has he returned empty-handed. His exploration of the well has borne fruit in the shape of several gold coins, which he takes to the moneylender Ragav, initially to pay off a debt, though the tables will soon turn as Vinyek becomes increasingly wealthy. This is demonstrated first through the appearance of several gold rings on his fingers, and then a montage sequence of his multiple trips to Tumbbad and a growing decadence in his lifestyle. All of this is accompanied by a song used as a recurring motif throughout the film, the lyrics of which tell the story of the movie as much as the visuals. This song is written by AJ Atul and Raj Shekhar, and the rest of the truly mesmerizing score is written by Jesper Kyd. Kyd is a Danish composer and sound designer who is perhaps best known for his work on video game franchises, including Assassin's Creed, Hitman and Warhammer. He was brought on board by Adesh Prasad and was immediately attracted to the project after seeing an initial cut, which at that stage was nearly 2 hours long. In later interviews, he said he liked the idea of working on a horror film, but that he also felt the film had a real passion and a purpose behind it, and a message that he found positive and very timely. Quote, "From the beginning, it became very clear that this movie needed 3 different music styles for the 3 different periods that it's set in. The first part is more music concrete, where music is made with found objects. It needed that superrealism to go with how the movie portrays those moments. Then the second part of it was a lot about mythology and creating a more epic sound in general. The third stage was the opposite, because we had a more personal sound in mind, so that the audience could connect with Vinyek and his actions and how it affects his family, so we used a lot of solo instruments there." By now, Ragav has become very suspicious as to where Vinyek keeps getting his gold from, and desperate for a piece of the opium trade, and with time running out, he installs a young woman in Vinyek's house as a distraction and makes his way to Tumbbad to discover for himself. The young girl, however, is rather easily bought off. In fact, she offers to reveal all in exchange for some money, and so our protagonist also makes his way to Tumbbad, where he tricks his former, and possibly only friend, into entering the well himself. Once he is inside, we get our first proper look at what lies within. Not a cave, but the womb of the mother goddess that we heard about in the opening story. Consciously avoiding the use of green screen, the womb structure itself took 20 days to shoot, and was described by Pankaj Kumar as, quote, "red, dazzling and pulsating. It was quite spooky to be inside it, and you would be disorientated when you came outside." End quote. It certainly makes for an impressive and unsettling location, dripping with moisture and mucus as Ragav makes his way inside and looks around. Sadly for him, but not unexpectedly, something monstrous leaps at him from the darkness, something that we do not see until Vinyek follows his friend inside to see what he has become. We see that Ragav has now become something rather like grandmother, immortal and suddenly ancient, embedded into the walls of the living cavern and moaning in pain and also, one assumes, hunger. And here we see that Vinyek, momentarily at least, regrets his actions. Gently weeping, he utters the magical phrase, "Sleep, or Hastar will come," and then returns to the main purpose of his visit, the collection of Hastar's gold. To achieve this, he removes a flower doll from his clothing, a charm that attracts the cursed and forgotten god and which gives us our first sight of Hastar himself. These special effects were created in post-production by a Swedish company called Filmgate Films, led by Sean Whelan and Martin Malmquist, who were also co-producers on the movie. And creating Hastar was certainly a challenge caused by the decision to avoid using green screen. Quote, "All of it was shot with no track marks and a constantly moving camera, which is the exact opposite way you shoot a VFX-heavy film. There were 14-minute takes of Hastar moving around randomly making faces, as there was no choreography done on location. Thankfully, the decision was taken to recreate Hastar entirely in 3D from scratch. It was very hard to make choices because what worked as a film cut didn't always work for the VFX. There were lots of shots that were not even shot, but we made them entirely in visual effects." End quote. And Hastar is an unforgettable being, avoiding the typical multi-tentacled monstrosities associated in the West at least with older gods. Instead, he is portrayed as a mottled red and incredibly lithe god king, complete with a golden crown. And whether he is a monster or not is rather up for debate. He is certainly monstrous in appearance and behavior, but as one commentator on the website Medium very succinctly put it, quote, "He is disturbing, unsettling, almost impossible to forget. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized. Hastar is not the real villain, because Hastar doesn't change. He is what he is, pure hunger. But humans, we choose to become like him." End quote. As Hastar, forever hungry, bends to devour the flower doll, Vignec frantically collects the gold coins that spill from his loincloth, and then just as frantically climbs the rope back out of the womb cave. As he does so, he shows his friend Ragav one small final act of mercy, setting fire to him on the way out before fleeing as the god chases him to the exit, aiming to turn him into a monstrous being as he did with Ragav and the grandmother before him. We now come to the final chapter of the movie, 1947, and an India finally moving into independence, a period of transition that is marked by dialogue between Vignec and some officials visiting his house. He asks them, now that India is free, what will they do to keep busy? To which one responds, quote, "You think our freedom struggle was to keep us busy? You're insulting me. This land, the land they looted and partitioned, is yours too, and that's why we seek your donation and your sympathy." End quote. But Vignec clearly doesn't understand their perspective and instead offers more money, showing that this is truly the only thing he understands, and that larger concerns, independence, freedom, and even family all pale into insignificance beside it. By now he has become fully corrupted, and it would appear addicted to opium. He is older, heavier, and he has been training his young son, Padurang, to assist him on his missions, something that the boy practices daily in the courtyard. Each day he climbs up and down ropes and collects coins from a dummy loincloth, marking his progress on a chalkboard every time he does. Vignec has also installed his mistress, the young woman sent as a decoy earlier in the story, and his wife, hurt, angry, and concerned for her young children, can do little more than helplessly look on. That Vignec is now motivated by pure greed rather than the betterment of his loved ones is demonstrated by the discovery that he keeps a safe beneath the floorboards, filled with banknotes and gold coins. Enough, young Pandurang tells him, to last them all a lifetime. "You're just like my mother," says Vignec. "She thought a coin would last a lifetime too." Vignec takes young Pandurang to Tumbbad, and here the film takes us full circle, as he recites the story we heard at the beginning, introduced though with a rather significant exchange, as Vignec says, quote, "If there was a god whose mere touch would turn you into an immortal, letting you live for centuries, and you know where the eternal treasury is, all you have to do is eat and sleep. Would you want that? End quote. Who wouldn't want such a blessing? Pandurang asks. One knows it's not a blessing, Vinyak replies, but a curse worse than death. And yet, knowing this, he still takes Pandurang down into the womb cave, telling him the first time that this is just for practice before they make a real attempt later. Here we discover why flour has been such an important motif throughout the story. Hastar may have stolen the gold from the other gods, but he couldn't get the grains, and so he yearns for flour, but he also dreads it too. The flour, ground by Vinyak's wife, therefore serves two functions. First, as a circle of protection that the god cannot cross without being destroyed, and secondly, as a temptation and a gift with which to distract him while they scavenge for his gold. However, although it is meant to be a test run, Pandurang, who appears just as greedy and corrupt as his father, has brought a flour doll with him. This, of course, draws Hastar right to them, but they do manage to escape, though not before the young boy has managed to grab his own share of the coins. Returning to the city of Pune, we see that the boy has become rather arrogant in his newfound wealth, insulting his mother, fighting with his father, and even propositioning his father's mistress, which leads to a historically accurate but deeply uncomfortable scene of juvenile marriage, though fortunately we don't see any more than that. Like I say, historically accurate for the period, but rather unpleasant for the modern viewer to observe. But unfortunately for Vinyak, time and independent India are no longer on his side. He discovers that the mansion in the village of Tumbbad and the land around it has been given to the new Indian government. They are going to build a new village there, and his access to Hastar's treasure will soon be lost forever. Encouraged by his son, they decide that they will simply steal Hastar's loincloth altogether, distracting him with multiple flour dolls to grab all of the gold at once. But gods, as we know, are not to be quite so easily tricked. Each flour doll produced attracts a new version of the god himself, and soon they are left surrounded by multiple incarnations of Hastar, all fighting over the various flour dolls, while at the same time trying to inflict their deadly curse. Vinyak decides to make one final bid for freedom, covering himself in multiple dolls to lure each version of the god toward him as he climbs up to the ceiling. At first we, and Pandurang, believe that his father is simply abandoning him, but as we discover, his plan is to lure Hastar into the various flower circles that have been drawn around the entrance, destroying each version of the god every time that they cross them, and leaving a pathway clear for Pandurang to make his final escape. As Pandurang makes his way to the surface, he becomes covered in flour and the ashy remnants of the various Hastars, a callback to the opening when young Vinyak was covered in flour as he was menaced by his grandmother. Emerging into the sunlight, he sees his father, who has finally paid the ultimate price for his greed. After many years of trying to outwit and outrun Hastar, he has finally failed at last. Bitten by the god, he is now a decaying figure like those before him. He pitifully offers his son the loincloth full of coins. Take it, he begs the boy. Didn't you want this? No, Pandurang replies, his eyes full of tears. Knowing that there is nothing more that he can do, and, unlike his father, finally appreciating that greed and inheritance do indeed come with a price tag, he utters the magical phrase, "Sleep, father, or Hastar will come," before setting Vinyak ablaze and freeing himself from the generational avarice that has plagued his family for decades. He makes his way from the mansion, closing the door behind him, as once again, it begins to rain. Tumbbad, a story about the corrupting nature of greed, but more than that, a story of India's history, premiered at the Venice International Film Festival in 2018, becoming the first Indian film to ever be screened there. It was also screened at Fantastic Fest, Sitges, the Screamfest Horror Film Festival, the 23rd International Film Festival of Kerala, and many more. It was then released in India on the 12th of October 2018. The critical response was largely positive, with the Times of India calling it moody and atmospheric and comparing it to Pan's Labyrinth and Eraserhead. I have to say, I get the first comparison, but not so much the second. The Indian Express called it highly unusual, visually stunning, and a richly atmospheric concoction of genre and themes. The website scroll.in said that it diversified genre astutely and without any gimmicks, going on to say, quote, "It has been a while since the horror film spoke so eloquently about something as primal as greed while remaining true to its Indian setting," end quote. Meanwhile, the Hollywood Reporter called it atmospheric, heavy with mythology and scary as hell, while Bloody Disgusting wrote, quote, "With a compelling story of greed that spans more than 30 years, a memorable monster, and some truly beautiful cinematography, Tumbbad is not to be missed." End quote. Made with a production budget of approximately 520,000 American dollars, quite amazing given the scope and the length of its production, in India alone it made $340,000 during its opening weekend, and by the end of its third week had earned $1.1 million. It's also won many awards, including Best Film, Best Cinematography, Best Background Score, and Best Production Design at events including the Critics' Choice Film Awards in India in 2019, Sitges, the International Indian Film Academy, the 2019 Screen Awards, and the Screamfest Horror Film Festival. However, the film and its director have not been without their fair share of controversies in more recent years. In March of this year, Rahi Anil Barve made an AI-assisted experimental horror film called Man Pisaash. He had his justifications for doing so, apparently, but none of them I'm going to bother repeating here. If you're interested in reading them, you can find them quite easily by looking online. More to the point though, in 2025, Tumbbad's producer, co-writer and creative director, Anand Gandhi, made quite a startling claim, saying that he had in fact ghost-directed Tumbbad himself, saying in an interview with IndianExpress.com, quote, "The big thing I want to clarify about Tumbbad is that I directed the film, and this is something that's well known within the industry. My credit on the film says creative director, and that's just basically a way to respect the fact that Rahi Anil Barve had started working on the film as a director first, before I had to take over as a director. I had to scrap the work that had been done, and I had to reshoot the film from the beginning, and hence I took a creative director credit, which, as you know in films, is a credit that does not pre-exist. So in the case of Tumbbad, I said we'll make up a credit called creative director. A director's job is all obviously the same as that of a creative director, but because in this case we had to make a distinction between the role that was committed to Rahi, I took on the title of a creative director, which was legally supposed to always come along with Rahi as per the contracts. That contract was not honoured on several occasions in the press and in other places by Tumbbad producer Sohum Shah. So far, I tried to not make that the main key point about the conversation, because I try not to get too much into the negative experiences of making a film. When I started the film, I started as a writer and producer, with Rahi supposed to direct it. But eventually, I directed the film. I had to make the whole film." End quote. Controversial stuff, but given this information, it is perhaps not surprising that neither he nor Rahi Anil Barve are associated in any way with Tumbbad 2, which is scheduled to be released in theatres worldwide on December the 3rd, 2027. This is being directed by Adesh Prasad and is once again being produced by Sohum Shah Films, with Sohum returning in the lead role. Given the ending of the first movie, I'm not quite sure what story this one will be telling, but I have to say, it's a film that I will definitely be watching. As you might have guessed from this review and analysis, I absolutely love this film, as it speaks to my love of folk horror, mythology, history, and, let's be honest, my fanboying over films that are aesthetically pleasing. An unusual take on folk horror in a subgenre that is, if we're honest, rather repetitive at times. If you watched it before listening to this episode, I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I do. And if you didn't watch it before listening to this episode, even though I have completely spoiled the basic storyline, there is still much to enjoy should you decide to do so. Onibaba and Tumbbad are both international folk horrors filmed under extremely challenging conditions, and both reference the histories of the countries in which they were made, one implicitly and the other explicitly. One is an analogy about the horrors of war and profiteering, and the other a warning against the all-consuming nature of greed. Together they show us that in the stories and the cinema of the past, there are lessons that we still need to learn, even today, though, given the headlines we see every morning, it's doubtful we are going to learn from them anytime soon. All of which brings me to the end of another incredibly long episode. I know I said a few months ago I was going to try to make these shorter, and for a couple of weeks at least, it looked like I was going to succeed, but as it turns out, I'm just not very good at doing that. So, if you are still with me, thank you very much for seeing it through to the bitter end. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And also, please consider sharing it with any horror-loving and incredibly patient friends. You can also write in to thehorrordouble@gmail.com and follow on Instagram @thehorrordouble. And just to let you know, I don't think next week's episode is going to be any shorter, as we're returning back to Europe and the world of the psychological thriller and the Italian giallo. Well, it's been at least 3 weeks since I've done one of those, so I think it's about time. First up, we head to France for Les Diaboliques from 1955, directed by Henri-Georges Clouzot. This stars Simone Signoret, Vera Clouzot, Paul Marousse, and Charles Vanel, and I can tell you now, there's some controversy surrounding the casting of this one. Then we follow this with The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward from 1971 and director Sergio Martino. This stars Edwige Fenech, George Hilton, Ivan Razimov, and Christina Eroldi. If you want to watch along, you can find out where they're screening in your area by visiting justwatch.com, and if you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be streaming in other regions. So, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.